Let's get started. Everyone, this is Chris Busch. His bio was in your reading, so you know a little bit about him. Given that we're running a little bit behind, I'm going to keep my introduction really short. We're going to be talking about some fascinating things today. We're continuing our discussion on policy and sustainability and the way that we sort of design before we design and these sorts of things. We're going to talk about carbon pricing, policy simulators, all sorts of really exciting stuff. So please join me in welcoming Chris Busch.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm a proud UC Berkeley graduate. Technically 3 graduate degrees from UC Berkeley, so including a master's in the policy program. So it's a pleasure to be back with you and share, I guess, some of what I feel like I've learned and to, I guess, also looking forward to the discussion and hearing your thoughts on this. As Eric said, feel free to let me know if something's unclear. We're covering a lot of ground in terms of time, space, global issues, but also technology. So there's a lot going on, and I want everyone to feel free to ask any questions. No questions barred. So let's see a little bit more about the talk, starting with some sort of motivation on the climate crisis, which I'm sure many people are already familiar with, just to motivate us and understand the problem we're trying to solve. Then I'll talk about climate policy design generally, and using a fair amount of material from this book that my group published a couple years ago. And it's also, the content's almost entirely available online at I believe energypolicy.solutions or energypolicy.solutions. Energypolicysolutions.com. Anyway, I should know that. There's a link at the end of the presentation, so happy to chat after the talk as well. Then Eric wanted some more detailed discussion of carbon pricing, so that'll be a third segment, and then we'll wrap up and have some discussion as well. So moving right into our first segment on the climate imperative, and the theme here is extremes become the norm, and the idea is that the average temperature changes that we hear discussed really mask the seriousness of the challenge before us and the importance of the climate transitioning to zero-emission economic activity. And that's because really it's what happens away from the averages that is going to be problematic. And so let me explain a bit more. First, talking a little bit about a recent example of extremes in California, and that is Sacramento, California. This past month in October experienced both its longest dry spell, which ended in October at 212 days without any rain, and it also experienced its most rain in a single day on October 24th. So just trying to move away from abstraction towards some of the specifics of the human consequences we're facing if we don't rapidly decarbonize. By which I mean, decarbonization people use as a new preferred terminology, sometimes for reducing emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. Decarbonization is a term you'll be hearing a lot in the climate policy discussions. So next, I want to show a bit of an example of average summer temperatures and how they've already been tipping towards extremes with the climate, the warming we've seen so far. And so we're going to look at, this is what I'm showing you here is a sort of a smooth representation of temperatures from 1950 to 1980, sort of a stable period before warming really started taking hold. And it follows roughly a normal distribution, and about a third of the days on average were below this average band in the middle. A third were hotter, and a third were average. So what we're going to see now is how over time, you'll see this is showing the years that are being mapped, and we're going to see over time how the distribution is shifting. And then in a moment, we're going to take a look at the consequences. So this is only warming through 2001 to 2011, so that's sort of a decade ago. But even still, you can see how much the hot temperatures have shifted over here. This is really where, the extremes are where the damages occur, because this is really largely beyond human experience for recent millennia. So our infrastructure is not, at homes people don't have air conditioners necessarily to deal with this heat. And so that's just one way that you can explore how our built environment was not optimized, or wasn't built for the climate that we're creating for ourselves. So just to show the end result here, the dashed yellow line shows the new average over the first decade of this millennium, and then you can see how it shifted, and as a result, we're in 1/12 of the time we're in extreme heat where we weren't even, that was an outlier of our normal experience before, and at 4/6 of the time, 2/3 of the time we're in this hot zone. Only 1/12 of the time are we in the area where temperatures were below normal before. So that gives you a little idea about temperature extremes, and of course, we're in a much more serious situation now with the continuation of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since then. So, moving on to any points you want to bring out, or does that just take a quick pause before we dive into the next section? Seeing no burning questions, let me move on here to this kind of overview of climate policy design. And the punchline is going to be that there's no silver bullet, and it really takes a portfolio of policies, a package of policies. There's no single policy can really deliver the reductions we need, and partly that's because this really used to revolve somewhat around carbon pricing. Some economists tend to view economic incentives as in economic models, economic incentives are carefully represented, and some of the other non-market barriers to change, hurdles, snags, you can think of it as inertia in the socioeconomic system. You get technological lock-in. For example, let me give you, jumping ahead, but a little example of a market failure, that just to be specific about what I'm saying. Think about a renter-landlord situation where the landlord is the one that pays for the refrigerator, pays for the heating system, heating and cooling if there's cooling, but the renters typically are the ones that pay the bill. So in that case, there's the incentive for investing in a more efficient, lower polluting, more advanced technology is not delivered by the market, because there's a split incentive, as it's called. So that's an example of a market failure that limits the reach of carbon pricing. What else here? Okay. Let's move into policy. And this is a graph from the New York Times recently, sort of framing the global talks. Great time to be doing this lecture, given the talks in Glasgow, the international talks. you may be familiar with the Paris Accords, which President Obama and other world leaders agreed to 5 years ago. And part of that Paris Accord was that every 5 years there would be a revisiting of the nationally determined contributions. Essentially, each country was going to come back and say what else they were going to be doing. So this particular international meeting, Conference of Parties, as it's called due to the treaty language, this particular Conference of Parties is particularly important because it's the time when each nation in the world is supposed to be revisiting and really increasing the ambition in their national plans. So that's a bit about Glasgow, and what this graph is showing us is before the Paris Accords, emissions were on a track to steadily increase. This is 2050. There's no time here. We're looking at time. This is greenhouse gas emissions. More emissions going up. Historical emissions, you can see with the black line there. This would have been the 2008-9 recession. So what this shows is that current policies put in place since the Paris Accord, when you program them all together and look at the sum effect, do lead to essentially a plateauing and a downward trend in global emissions over time. But that's not even quite the policies. You can distinguish emission pledges. For example, the U.S. has, under President Biden, has pledged a 50% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. So when you put those kinds of pledges into systems and dynamics analysis, you get this deeper level of reductions. And what I wanted to bring out with that is the difference between an emission reduction pledge versus policies that are in regulation and law. So President Biden is understandably getting some grief because the politics in the United States are limiting the scope for us to put these necessary regulations in place. Although I would say, I think there's good reason to think that the U.S. can hit its target. Although that may depend on the Supreme Court not invalidating the EPA and other agencies' ability to write rules that, in the way they've been doing, there's some question about whether the Supreme Court may take away some of the regulatory authority that is now understood to exist, and that would be problematic. So this is, when you look at the sum effect of regulations and in place laws, this is the global trajectory. This is where Paris pledges took us when you add up just what countries said they were going to do. For example, China had said that they were going to peak emissions around 2030. China is the largest emitter in the world right now. The United States is the largest historical emitter. So China has been getting some pressure because they haven't really substantially increased their pledge from last time. They did in a marginal way. Instead of saying they're going to peak emissions around 2030, now they're saying by 2030. So ruling out 2031, 2032. But this line down here shows the trajectory that we would need to hit in order to have a good chance of avoiding warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius so far, and the scientific view is that above this point there's going to be increasing risks of extreme or catastrophic effects, and so there's a large push to try to hit this type of trajectory. You'll notice it requires, this is about 2030 here, it requires about a 50% reduction in global emissions by 2030. If we want to hit, that's a shorthand for if we the world wants to have a good chance at reaching this 1.5 degree threshold, we need to really sharply reduce emissions over the next decade. You'll notice just one last thing about this graph. You'll notice how it actually goes negative down here. This is a zero emission line. So this scenario assumes that carbon dioxide removal will be scaled up eventually and have a meaningful effect by then, including not just forests, but some of the engineered carbon dioxide removal that are technologies under development. Whether you're just pulling carbon dioxide out of the air with a machine, or another way to go carbon negative is if you are combusting bioenergy and then you bury the carbon dioxide afterwards, that can be considered carbon negative. Okay. This next graph shows different, again, talking about global, this is global trajectories. This is, here you can see they've got the axis labeled, gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. So this is global emissions per year, increasing over time. What this graph shows is that we need action soon. There are costs to delay, and the cost of delay is much sharper action in the future. And this is important because we're hearing a lot of pledges around carbon neutrality, for example. India pledged to reach carbon neutrality, meaning net zero emissions by 2070. But the point is that we need interim action, and so while that's good news, and India deserves to be thanked and deserves appreciation for that progress, we also need near-term action and specific steps. And India also actually has been doing a lot with their renewable energy goals as well, so that's some good news. But there's something climate policy activists, if you will, are on the lookout for is politicians making far-off promises to take the pressure off, but not necessarily taking action that's consistent with reaching those serious goals. And so that's something to be on the lookout for. What these numbers here show us is the annual rate of reduction in emissions needed to get to net zero with later and later starts. So this line starting faster requires only a 1.5% annual reduction to get to zero, whereas this later start, the latest start in purple, would require 7.1% annual reductions in order to get to the same goal. So there's a bit of a tension here, just in that innovation is ongoing, and so just if I'm being honest, the economists will point out the benefits of delay. It almost pains me to say that, but there is an upside in that uncertainty means that there's a benefit to waiting because there will be more clarity on what the favorable technologies are, and costs are declining steadily. So that's a bit of a balancing factor that, since I'm in an academic context, I'll mention in the spirit of full coverage. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. This is a web page from our energypolicy.solutions site, and this is an interesting, really information-packed site that I hope everyone can visit. These are open source models that you can download, and they're changeable. They run on a software called VenSim. If you're tech savvy and you want to, it's a nice, you can actually change the inputs, for example, for free. There's a free model reader. If you go to more info at any of these models, it tells you how to install the model. And it's also a way to actually get data on these countries, because there's data loaded as well as in Excel form or CBS form as well. So these are all models that also have a web interface, and you can dial up or down policy intensity. And we could even talk about maybe an assignment that might encourage exploring this, like finding different pathways to different reductions. And it gives you real-time results. It shows a business as usual trajectory, and then as you turn up policies, you get real-time results on the effect. There's about 50 preloaded graphics with breaking down policy by policy costs, etc. It's quite a rich tool. So this is informing a lot of the larger points I'm making, and so I wanted to let you know about the energypolicy.solutions website. And there you can also find links to the guide I showed you, the information about the climate policy, designing climate policy solutions book. This is from the book. This picture is from the book, and what it shows is the policies that were developed, put together in order to reach reductions of about half, 50% chance. The book is a couple years old now. The science is a little further, but what I wanted to do was give you a specific example of a package of policies. I mean, this is a global look at the problem, and so we can also, in discussion, talk specifically about what California's package looks like, if you'd like. But I wanted to show really the combination of different sectors that are being addressed. So you can see here, this is land use, changes in land use. This is, so they're color-coded, so that the yellow are within emission reductions in power generation, in the power sector, as it says here. That's and so we're referring here to renewable portfolio standards. And so, for example, California has a 60% by 2030 standard currently, on the way to at least 100% carbon-free energy by 2045 is the current law, although that's about to be actually increased. So that's an example of specific example of a renewable portfolio standard. These are in industry. California just passed the first law that I believe exists, specifically targeting cement emissions, and it requires a 40% reduction in carbon intensity by 2035, which it's not a very stringent target, but it was a win because they were able to get it passed and to get industry on board. So you can see here carbon pricing in this example delivered about 25% of the reductions overall that they came up with in this package of policies. Urban mobility, that's sort of about like anti-sprawl, giving people like neighborhoods that are walkable and transit accessible. Rebates are essentially kind of like incentives on EVs and paid for by charges on more polluting vehicles. Vehicle electrification, actually, California has a lot to be proud of in this regard. In 1990, the state established something called the Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate, which required minimum percentages of EV sales in the car and truck, in new car and truck sales. A minimum percentage have to be zero emission. And actually, so now China is using this approach. China has gotten up to, in some months, they've reached as high as 20% zero emission vehicles. Last year, China was at about 1.1 million electric vehicles sold. Electrics referring both to plug-ins and full electrics, but something with a plug. Trends are looking like they could hit 3 million this year. And with what's going on in Europe, we can look at something like 6 or 7 million zero-emission vehicles sold this year, up from 3 million last year, which was an increase of over 2 million from the year before, which is pretty impressive when you consider that last year was heavily COVID impacted. So the trends are great in zero-emission vehicles, and California gets a lot of credit as being an early leader in that regard, although really California's been taken over, I would say, by the Europeans in terms of leading on zero-emission and electric vehicles. Norway is up to about 80% electric vehicles in their new sales. In some months approaching 100%. So, it's also true while we're talking about good news stories, solar power is, renewables are attracting more investment than any other type of power generation technology right now, more than natural gas, and so more renewables are being installed, mostly solar, but also wind, than fossil. It's still not fast enough, but solar is really, the cost improvements have been incredible. About a 90% reduction in cost over a decade. We've seen wind also falling 60%, but it was a more mature technology. So those are some things going on, I guess, policy-wise and technology-wise in this slide. Let me make sure yeah, well, you see here, the building codes. This is one of the ways to solve the split incentive with renters and landlords. And so you require a certain minimum level of efficiency because the market isn't going to deliver it itself. California also has the earliest building codes in the United States. I think that's covering that. What we're looking at here is a cost curve for all these different policy or technology options. And so, again, you see a color coding on the top on the different, whether it's buildings in light blue, transportation darker blue, industry yet a darker blue, electricity darkest blue, land use again in yellow, and orange is cross-sector, meaning carbon pricing. What this shows is sort of, and also this is going to connect to a graph I'm going to show you later. So I just want to develop this idea of a cost curve, and you can see here this is the least expensive option. The most economically beneficial option is improved urban mobility there, and that is allowing people to switch modes to walking, biking, and transit, and then the savings really come from having to buy fewer cars and also paying for less transportation fuel. It's one of the clearest win-win policies, and that doesn't even really count for all the public health benefits from less sedentary lifestyles and other community benefits just from less social isolation. Like, I know I moved up to Marin County from San Francisco several years ago, and when I was doing a fair amount of work in this area, and you're just much more isolated, and everywhere you go you have to get in the car, and there's just not as much intermixing of communities, and neighbors don't know themselves as much. So anyway, this is the most advantageous policy here is urban mobility. The width of the bar is the magnitude of emission reductions, and then so the height of the bar is the economic effect. So vehicle electrification is also saving big here. At the higher end of the scale, some of the most expensive emission reductions that they included in that package I showed in the last slide is gas to industry fuel switching, and that's basically, as it sounds like, finding ways that industry uses natural gas currently, burns natural gas currently, finding substitutions for those uses where electrical equipment can do the same job. So that is currently one of the more expensive options, but there's actually a lot of innovation bringing down, for example, heat pumps that are an efficient way to a new efficient way to perhaps lower that compared to where that was a couple years ago. All right. Let's see. Should I try to wrap up in about 10 minutes or 15?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, let's get into carbon pricing a little bit, in a little bit of detail. First, I just wanted to explain the idea of cap and trade, or as it's sometimes called, emission trading systems. I mentioned both terms because California, the term you'll most often hear is cap and trade or a cap and trade program, but in a lot of other places, for example, the European program is generally called an ETS. So on the next slide I'll use both terms, but you might hear about the EU ETS, for example. That's the European Union's cap and trade program, which was the biggest in the world until China launched theirs fairly recently, and that's now the largest in the world. We can talk more about what's going on with that if there's interest. So this is the idea with carbon pricing. The advantage is it allows a flexible response. So it doesn't require equal reductions at each source, and therefore it allows for more investment where there's lower costs, where there's more cost-effective reductions, and places where the costs are higher can reduce less, and the overall cost to society will be lower that way. So that's a bit of what we're seeing here. You know, if I had time, I was gonna block this out and just put cap. This is like the cap here. This is like the overall level of emissions is one way to think about it. Although it's really like multiplied by the number of emitters. But so like 2 times that is the cap if there's just 2 emitters in this example here. What we have are 2 factories, and in this case, and we're seeing like their real emissions are different. Like this one has emissions at this level, and the other one has higher emissions actually at the level of the cap. The idea with a cap and trade market is that this emitter won't need all the tradable permits, as they're sometimes called, or allowances. I'll call them allowances. This emitter, this factory, won't require all the there'll be extra permits left in the system because this factory doesn't require this quantity, and so this quantity is available then to be transferred to this polluter, and the overall cap can be met at a lower cost. That's the basic idea. There's some complications around, like if you know, it's not complications, but some of the nuances or important design aspects are, you know, whether the permits or allowances are given away for free or are they auctioned. You'll see here reference to offset credits. That's a whole other can of worms. Those are, notice here we're talking about emissions. You can measure these emissions, and these are measurable quantities. Offsets are a different animal. They're quite complicated. The idea is that they're emission reduction, they're emissions that don't happen. They're avoided emissions, and they are often, people think of them in forests, for example. Some of the earliest offsets were from forest projects, stopping a forest from getting cut down, and then the idea is that these offset credits can be sold to someone else, with the idea again being that if there are other low-cost reductions, this is a way to bring them into the system. Now, offsets, because they're something that's avoided, they're actually not a tangible thing. You can't measure them. Think about the forest. You don't see it being cut down. The benefits are not an assumption, but they're a calculation based on the idea that the forest would have been cut down anyway. So they're somewhat controversial, and they're complicated, and but usually they're in the range of 5 to 8% of the overall picture, if you will. For example, if I'm a company or a polluter and I have 100 units of pollution I need to cover, I have to have something like 95 or a high amount of my emissions have to be covered with permits, and only a small amount of my emissions can be covered with offsets. It's complicated. Don't worry if it's not super clear, but we can come back to it if there's interest. Some other factors around carbon pricing is just what sources are covered. What's the scope of coverage. California has a wide program that covers almost all, or about 80% of fossil fuel combustion emissions. The EU ETS is a sort of mid-case that covers most industry, power generation and other heavy industry. One of the narrowest caps is the Northeastern States program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that only covers the power sector. So scope of the program is another important aspect. With this slide, though, I wanted to just also introduce the counterparts in the carbon pricing topic, if you will, and that is the carbon tax or fee. And so I just want to contrast the cap and trade program, which is one extreme, if you will, of carbon pricing, and another extreme is a price instrument, which is setting a price. And it's a carbon tax, so there's a certain price per ton emitted. And the reason those are sort of pure examples at the extremes are, in this case, there is certainty around what happens on emissions, but there's a fair amount of uncertainty about cost. And then the reverse is true on this. There's certainty in terms of businesses know what the cost is going to be per ton, but from a policymaker perspective, it's challenging to know what the effect is going to be on emissions. So 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there was a lot of vigorous debate about which was better. Carbon pricing, cap and trade programs, and let's see, some of the things that people would discuss. For example, carbon tax or fee can be seen as more investment friendly because of the certainty it provides around the effect on economics, and so it's easier to factor that in to investment decisions, for example. But typically, in times past, people didn't really think of offsets as part of a carbon tax regime, and so carbon taxes were a disadvantage that people would discuss about carbon pricing, is that it doesn't allow for offsets to bring in these other low-cost reductions. Now, today there's more of a hybridization going on, and you can actually see some countries with carbon tax will allow you actually to satisfy it with offsets. And so there's a bit of a breaking down of these, dichotomy, if you will, this black and white dichotomy towards more of a nuanced understanding. And, you know, looping back to climate policy overall, I think that's also true that in times past there was more of a battle over what's better, command and control policies, which was viewed as quantity instruments, versus market mechanisms. What was better, market mechanisms? And now I would say there's more understanding of their complementarity between the two. And let me give you an example of a policy that breaks down the dichotomy, and that is the California zero-emission vehicle mandate. Now, it's a mandate. It sets the specific minimum requirements for manufacturers in terms of their percent sales, and if they don't hit those percentages, they have to go and buy zero-emission vehicle credits from other automakers. And so actually, in several quarters, Tesla's profitability has hinged on these zero-emission vehicle credits. So that's an example of a more narrow, sector-specific, even technology-specific. Although it's not an electric vehicle standard, because fuel cell vehicles could qualify. It's about the vehicle doesn't have any emissions, so that's why it's called a zero-emission vehicle standard. It's technology neutral. It's really a performance standard. As long as a vehicle doesn't have emissions, it can qualify. But it also, so it's more narrow than and prescriptive than sort of a theoretical example of what an economist might say a flexible policy should be. But it also does include these aspects that encourage efficiency. It's a more tailored policy that also has market features to keep costs lower. Okay. The last bit I want to do are to go over some graphs from the book on carbon pricing to show you how the ETS or the cap and trade policy or the quantity instrument looks versus the price instrument, and then also show you the advantage that the hybrid policy leads to. So here is a marginal abatement cost curve. Now actually this one's flipped, and it's got the more expensive policies listed first, and these are the lowest quality emission reductions, but the concept's the same. You can think of this curve as actually a bunch of different chunks of emission reduction opportunities. And what we see, and so this is, some reduction. The lowest cost reduction can get us down to this level, and it has this price. And so the price increases as you go and move through more and more expensive options. What this blue band is meant to show is an uncertainty range around the cost, because there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of variation in what equipment people are using. It's hard to come up with a single answer, which is actually one reason policy makers sometimes like carbon pricing, is because it's a bit less, it's a bit more information light. It's viewed as a way of handling asymmetric information, as it's known, in the sense that companies know best what their costs are, what their options are, and it's harder for regulators to know that. And so this blue band is an uncertainty, reflects uncertainty about the true costs around the expected costs of emission reduction, shown with this black line. And so this shows the emissions you'd achieve. This is more emissions. This is the emissions you'd achieve if there was no carbon pricing policy. This is we're just taking this solution, if you will, as an optimal solution that if we knew exactly what the costs were, we would want to end up at. This is an optimal quantity. We want to reduce emissions from this level down here, And what this graph is telling us is that the carbon price that would result, or that would, if the carbon price that would be needed to get there is this P star one. And so if we knew the exact shape of this curve, it would be no problem to either set a quantity restriction. We could set a cap at this level and we'd end up at this point with this price. Or we could set a carbon tax at this price and we would end up with this quantity. So that's the setup. Now I'm going to show you how the reality of uncertainty leads to uncertain emission reductions with the carbon price approach. So in this example, we're setting a carbon price here, this P fixed. And as a result, we're going to be, because there's this uncertainty band, we're not sure where we're going to be. It's going to be somewhere between this lower level of emissions and a higher level of emissions. And that's really just what those words are saying there. So this shows with the carbon price how you end up with a fairly large band of uncertainty about the emission reductions on the effect of emissions. This is the counter, the other extreme answer, example, the other half of the dichotomy, if you will, the other pure carbon price example of a quantity type. And so in this instance, again, the same setup. In light of the reality of uncertainty, if we set this level cap, we might end up with a price down here, or we might end up with a price up here. And so this is the range of price uncertainty that would result from that in that setup. Now the next graph is going to show then how when you put what's called a price collar, the next graph is going to say policymakers view this level of variation as too great. They want to constrain the prices, and they do so with something that's sometimes called a price collar, referring to containing something, or you can think of it as a price ceiling and a price floor. So we're going to see how setting a price ceiling and a price floor is going to I guess, in the end, lead to a more balanced approach to uncertainty, because we can't have either extreme price or extreme quantity uncertainty. We really want to have a balance or a blend of the advantages of the two. And so this is a bit complicated, but really what this is showing is, so this shows the price floor here and the price ceiling. And what that does is that instead of allowing the, well, it shrinks the range of the emission reductions uncertainty down to this smaller level. So instead of being way down here, which would mean which would mean, so if we were way out here, if the price was down here, here's about where the price ended up without any price floor. And if that was the case, it would be about here. So you can see how this price collar shrinks the uncertainty around emission reductions, and by allowing some uncertainty on the carbon price. And generally, this is the way that carbon pricing is going. So California, although California is the only state, the only example really of a what you say, explicit or defined price collar. The European Union has some political hurdles to putting this type of approach. So they have something called a market stability reserve to keep the prices in a particular range. So that is what I was mainly hoping to discuss. I guess to wrap up, and we can always go back to cover anything that I went over too quickly or that we want to go into more discussion on. And I didn't necessarily bring this point out so much at the beginning, but another aspect of climate change are the nonlinear or the feedback effects which could accelerate warming. For example, the melting permafrost in the northern latitudes is releasing methane. Or the loss of sea ice makes the ocean darker, which increases heat absorption, increasing warming. So those are a couple examples of some of the negative feedbacks in the sense of negative from a human survivability perspective in terms of worsening warming. And so there's this potential for nonlinear change. But there's also, and our modeling shows that with the right combination of policies, we can quickly and efficiently make the changes we need and avoid the future we don't want to live in. And so I hope we can all join and get there. So that's what I had prepared, and thanks for your attention, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, so everyone, what's on your mind?
Like section 4?
Yeah, section 4.
Something that I just discussed, and something that might be discussed is that given what we know about how drastic reductions need to be made in emissions, and not necessarily to be reaching zero or below zero, do you see that as being in tension with the fact that the cap and trade approach sort of motivates progress up to a certain threshold? And how do you go from a cap and trade approach to ultimately zero emissions?
I see, yeah. Good points. Yeah, I think part of what your comment or question makes me think of is that this emission trading systems are really best for sweeping up like a portion of low-cost short-term reductions. It's not so good at sending long-term innovation signals, but you know, the amount of the cap can go down towards approaching zero, but so I don't think the instrument is consistent with deep reductions, but between the market failures, which mean it has limited scope, between the political limitations, there's no question that when an economy is mostly running on carbon energy, that when you put a carbon price in place without adjustments, that the prices are going to go up. So there's that's one thing that's holding back carbon pricing in California. The oil companies are ready to pounce and say to make the political hay out of it. So I would say what your question makes me think of is that we really need a whole set of policies, including innovation policy. We need sector policies. We can't count, for example, on a carbon price driving the zero-emission vehicle or electric vehicle transition we need. But and even my group has shown pathways to deep reductions that don't rely on carbon pricing. But I think all else equal, carbon pricing can be consistent with improving social equity. For example, there are studies showing in Canada that people are better off on average, including when they get a dividend back. They get some of the money back from the Canadian pricing program in a lump sum. So I think carbon pricing can be helpful, but I guess where I would end up is, you wouldn't want to depend on it too much, and there's a whole range of factors going on. Like in California, there's deep distrust amongst the environmental justice movement, dating back to, I would say, there was a program called Reclaim, which was targeting NOx, the small contributions. Some of the earliest cap and trade programs came out of the 1990 Clean Air Act law, federal law, allowed for these starting in 1990. So there was an acid rain program that was mostly in the East Coast. We didn't have a big problem here, but in the West there was something called Reclaim, which was targeting NOx, which is important precursor for smog. But for many years that program was mired at a price of zero because there were too many permits, because it was hard to, because of this issue of really there hadn't been a hybrid set yet. So if you're worried about prices getting out of control, you're quite cautious at the start. And so understandably for, I would say, environmental activists, that experience created distrust of market mechanisms. And as we were having some discussions as well earlier, sometimes activists liken carbon pricing to the indulgences that the Catholic Church used to give, where sinners could pay to be relieved of their sins. And so there are some moral issues around responsibility that I think are also kind of tied up in what you raised. So.
Question? What else?
My group was talking a lot about the different policies, and we were wondering if you've seen any studies that kind of compare the effectiveness of like cap and trade versus carbon tax.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I mean, probably there's a Professor Larry Goulder at Stanford University that has a paper. I can, if you want, I can help you find one. But there's definitely studies. I think Larry Goulder has the most famous example that I would recommend. But it's pretty academic.
Based on your observations, like, what do you think is more effective?
That's a good question. Well, my sense is that a cap and trade or emission trading system is better as long as it's not overrun with offsets, because it's easier to because it doesn't specify what the cost is going to be. It's less specific about cost, and it focuses on the reductions. But generally, our approach in recent years has been to, when we're doing carbon pricing research or advocacy, is to basically work within the confines of whatever that policy debate is, whatever the place we're working in, whatever's the favored approach, we can work with that. So, for example, the problem with carbon prices is we don't know what the reductions are, but the solution is to have a mechanism to have them go, the price goes up if we're not hitting the reductions we need. So I guess where I'd end up is thinking, we see that the European Union price has got up to about 60 euros per ton. And so as I keep talking, I'm going to land on that as when I think of what's worked, the European Union approach is the best example, and it's a big example, and it's where China's looking. So, and it puts the emphasis on emissions and emission reductions. So, it'd be my slight preference, but generally, I'd say generally from the perspective of making change, I'd suggest just working within the existing confines of the policy dialogue, if you will. Long answer. I probably could have said that in half as many words, but hopefully you got there.
Thanks.
You mentioned this a little bit, but I was curious about how you and your group connects with lawmakers and writing policy. Like, are you ever, hired as a consultant, or you just focus on making resources for people to draw from, or how does that work?
It's a good question. Yeah, I didn't talk too much about our group. We're a funny, unusual example where My boss, Hal Harvey, has these deep roots in philanthropy. He started the Energy Foundation, which was a important U.S. foundation, and then was the first CEO of the Climate Works Foundation. So he has these deep ties in like Silicon Valley philanthropy. So we're fortunate. Even though we're not a nonprofit, we're basically funded like a nonprofit, and we don't have any like new business pressure. So we work all the time with policymakers. For example, something going on in California right now is like they're refreshing our strategy. It's called the 2022 Scoping Plan. Every 5 years we have to do a scoping plan, and which is basically like a strategy. It's sort of how all the policies are supposed to fit together. So I've put a couple letters in on that, and I've been consulting, working with some environmental justice groups, trying to offer what answers I can to some of the questions they're having. But all the time, actually my boss now is my former boss, Sonia Agarwal, is in the White House, the Domestic Climate Policy Office. She's worked for Gina McCarthy. And also, so yeah, we have great, we are fortunate. We really try to focus on policymakers. We're a research orientation, but unusual in our really focus on change on real world policy. So yeah, we try to push them behind the scenes privately. We put in some like comment letters. I'm not happy at all with what California is doing on our strategy. I'll send you our letters if you want. But also, actually working in China, I've been doing a fair amount on China recently. My boss, when he was with the Hewlett Foundation, he started something called the China Energy Foundation. And so we, they're working on their national ETS, as they call it. They had several pilots, and so it's about twice as big as the EU. And so that's an interesting, another place we work, but it's a range of things that it's hard to know what makes a difference, but it's a privilege to feel like you're doing work that might make a difference. We're hiring, by the way. We got look, check out our org. We're growing.
Yeah.
I guess you're a freshman. Sorry, you've got a few years, but maybe in the summer.
Internship.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the challenges of implementation of these kind of policies, and I guess to sort of narrow the scope, what are some of the challenges in the U.S.?
Let's see. Did you have mind more like getting some strong laws in place, or let's see, implementation? Okay, a few things come to mind. Say, for example, like in federal fuel economy standards, they require they get the regulators face pushback from the car companies saying we can't make people buy these cars. So a challenge, or in California, for example, let me think of another example for you. We have a zero-emission truck rule that is pretty outstanding, actually. And it goes up to currently to about 60% zero-emission vehicles required in trucks by 2035. Probably going to move faster, but in these instances where you put, it depends on consumer action. So it's a requirement that the companies will say we can't determine what people are going to buy. So they'll try to put the blame on consumers and saying things need to go slower. That's an example. Or there's other examples, just technical complications like California. Our cap and trade program, it has, although I never used to really think of this, but you may have heard of carbon border adjustments, which is like, the EU has a big one. They're going to start requiring like cement, steel producers from outside to, if they don't have a similar carbon price or other climate policies, they're going to have to pay extra fees. That's a really big topic in the news these days. But actually California has something kind of like that on electricity. Like imported electricity is covered. But it can be challenging to track. And so there's this whole category. It's easy when there's like specified electricity where you can track it back to a plant. But there's this whole category called unspecified electricity. I don't understand all the nuances, but some of these imported emissions are pegged with a kind of an average, they're called a benchmark or a deemed rate. It's like, it's a level that's assigned to these types of imports, but it can be hard to get right, and I understand that it encourages the dirty stuff to come in as unspecified, which is a problem. There's a economist here, Meredith Fowley, in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics, where I did my doctoral work, that's advised the state a lot on this, is one of the world's leading experts. So Meredith Fowley is great on leakage, and a great person as well. So there are a couple ideas that come on. We could get into offsets more if you want, but I don't want to necessarily take too long on that. If we want to cover, just check the time. All right, so we'll go to...
Yeah, I got one more question.
Okay.
I was just curious, one of the first things I think of when I hear like a carbon tax is the concerns that people have raised that like the burden of the carbon tax could fall on like consumers or even like low income consumers. How do you think about equity in conversations when writing policy? Like, can you use tools to design policy to be equitable as well?
That's a good question. That's all good, very good questions. Well, you're right. It's a matter of concern, as I mentioned about the cost effects passing through to consumers. For example, there's another Berkeley economist, David Rowland Holst, who's done modeling for the state. And his model has impacts broken out by income level and also by zip code. Or census tract, actually. Maybe that's the same. I forget. But he's got spatially explicit, so you can look at communities that have been historically burdened by high levels of pollution. So one of the things I don't want to say nagging or pestering, but I don't want to say tagging, criticizing the board about their resources board is that they didn't pick David Rowland Holst's model. So there's a few different, so our model, the energy policy simulator, it looks at, for example, effects on jobs by different ethnic and racial groups. I don't know if they do income effects. It looks on effects by union and non-union jobs. I don't know if they're looking at effects by income level yet. I've got to redo. I did the California model originally, but they've changed it a lot, so I've got to learn a new model. But our model has worked to try to take more social equity impacts into account. And then I would say, I can loop back to that example of the Canadian carbon pricing program, which I think they returned most of the money or all of it in a lump sum, but because that's a bigger boost for the lower income households, it was net positive on equity. So I'd say, one of the tensions or balancing points is like, I guess you see it in policy overall on like whether we want to means test stuff to target the benefits to the people that need it most, or if we want to have universal benefits that help grow like buy-in more broadly. But you could imagine like a low income, graduated rebates for the biggest payments for the lowest income households and people that need it the most. California has spent at least 35% of its revenue have to go to disadvantaged communities. We've got something called the Clean Car Credit, which gives up to $9,500 to low-income families in disadvantaged communities to buy EVs, used EVs. And so I did a study recently that showed that could reduce transportation costs by 40% compared to a gas car when you include that kind of incentive. So those are a few thoughts, but generally that's been the big hurdle in terms of, I think, slowing down consumer price effects and equity effects overall are some of the bigger snags on carbon pricing, for sure.
All right, thank you so much.